What happens when a king, once revered for his beauty and power, becomes a living corpse long before death takes him? Picture this: a bloated body, disfigured beyond recognition, festering wounds leaking pus, and an odor so revolting that even seasoned courtiers fainted in his presence. When he finally died, fluid seeped from his coffin, so foul, so disturbing, that stray dogs licked them from the floor. This was no ordinary end. This was the horrifying death of one of England's most infamous monarchs. Today, we uncover the grotesque reality behind the final days of King Henry VIII, a story so vile, so rarely told in full, that it chills the soul. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491. At just 17 years old, he ascended the throne, already celebrated as the epitome of royal grace and masculine perfection. He was tall, strong, and strikingly handsome, with golden red hair and a commanding presence that captivated all who saw him. One Venetian ambassador even wrote that Henry possessed an extraordinary physique and angelic face, more beautiful, he said, than any Christian prince in Europe. But how did this majestic, powerful figure descend into such a shameful and agonizing death? The downfall began with a single brutal event, a jousting accident in January of 1536 at Greenwich. At the age of 44, Henry suffered a catastrophic fall when his horse collapsed on top of him. He lay unconscious for 2 full hours. Though he survived the ordeal, the injuries, particularly the severe trauma to his right leg, would never fully heal. That one moment changed everything. What followed was a slow, agonizing transformation. The injury became a festering ulcer that refused to close. It oozed constantly, filling rooms with a stench so putrid that people could smell the king before they saw him. For a monarch obsessed with his image, this was a devastating blow. And yet no one dared react. Courtiers were expected to endure the vile odor in silence. Any sign of revulsion could cost them dearly, perhaps even their lives. This period also marked a disturbing shift in Henry's personality. Perhaps coincidentally, or perhaps not, it was shortly after the accident that Henry ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The charges were adultery and treason, though many historians now consider them fabricated. Some suggest the head trauma may have worsened his paranoia and deepened his violent mood swings. Whatever the cause, the once charming prince was becoming a tyrant. With his injury limiting movement, Henry began to gain weight rapidly. His once trim waist, a mere 89 kilograms in youth, ballooned to over 130 cm. His weight eventually surpassed 180 kg. He grew so heavy that he could no longer move freely and had to be transported between chambers using a mechanical pulley system. Even the palace doorways had to be widened to accommodate his massive frame. And his lifestyle did nothing to help. Henry's royal diet was a recipe for disaster. Records from the palace kitchens reveal he consumed around 5,000 calories a day, mainly from red meat, with barely a trace of vegetables. A typical evening meal featured endless meat pies, heavily spiced dishes, and enormous amounts of ale and wine. Combined with his growing inactivity, this indulgent routine only hastened his physical collapse. The ulcers on his legs worsened dramatically. In an era without modern medical knowledge, the treatments were often more damaging than the disease. Physicians tried everything, from searing the wounds with hot irons to applying pastes laced with mercury and arsenic. They even resorted to frequent bloodletting, which only weakened him further. Over time, the ulcers grew so deep and rotten that bone could be seen through the decaying flesh. The smell he carried was unbearable, so much so that it was said people could detect his presence from 3 rooms away. And yet, even in this state, Henry sought to relive his youth. At 49, he married Catherine Howard, a mere 19-year-old girl. He described this marriage as a revival of his younger self, but in truth, it was a grotesque display. Catherine, unable to stomach her deformed and foul-smelling husband, soon sought love and comfort elsewhere, in the arms of a younger man. When the scandal of Queen Catherine Howard's affair finally came to light, the reaction was as swift as it was merciless. Henry, enraged and humiliated, ordered the execution of both his young wife and her lover. Their heads fell under the blade, just as so many others had, leaving no doubt that the king's wrath knew no bounds. It was another chapter soaked in blood, a stark reminder of the price of betrayal in Henry's court. His final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 was a stark contrast. There was little romance, if any, in this union. It was a calculated political alliance. Catherine, intelligent and composed, understood the danger of her position. Unlike her predecessors, she played the role of caregiver more than consort, tending to the king's ever-worsening condition with admirable patience and devotion. Considering the grim fate of the women who came before her, her loyalty is almost astonishing. In the final years of his life, Henry VIII's body became a prison of agony. Medical historians now believe he suffered from a host of chronic illnesses: uncontrolled diabetes, severe gout, congestive heart failure, and dangerously high blood pressure. Some also speculate that he may have had syphilis, although this remains a topic of debate among modern scholars. What is beyond doubt, however, is that these illnesses combined to turn his remaining days into a relentless ordeal of pain and decline. Contemporary accounts paint a picture of a man haunted by both physical torment and mental anguish. At times he screamed in rage, cursing anyone within earshot. At others, he slipped into dark silences, sitting motionless for hours, as if weighed down by the crushing gravity of his own decay. His famous paranoia, always simmering, boiled over in his final years. The sharp-minded statesman who once steered a kingdom had given way to a tyrant, consumed by imagined plots and traitors in every shadow. Close friends, trusted advisors, no one was safe. Fear reigned in the royal court. A misplaced word, a stray glance, anything could be twisted into evidence of treason. Even the noble Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, fell victim to the king's delusions, executed just 9 days before Henry himself would die. The king's terror of being poisoned reached a fever pitch. He instituted an elaborate security routine in the kitchens, forcing servants to taste every morsel of food before it touched his lip. The ritual became obsessive. Every utensil was inspected, every goblet, every plate scrutinized. Was this the act of a careful ruler, or the unraveling mind of a man on the brink? Some experts believe these behaviors point to mini strokes and declining mental health, but whatever the cause, the results were tragic. By the end, Henry's suffering defied comprehension. As the curtain fell on his life, the king could no longer walk, barely even sit upright. Gangrene had taken hold of his legs, deepening the already sickening stench that clung to him like a shroud. Courtiers moved through the palace with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, drenched in perfumed oils, struggling to mask the odor. Still, they dared not flee the royal presence. The winter of 1546 into early 1547 was particularly brutal. Henry's body, ravaged by infection, was racked with high fevers and violent chills. Modern doctors believe he likely suffered from septicemia, the result of unchecked infections coursing through his bloodstream. His breathing grew labored, and his skin took on a ghastly hue. Periods of lucidity grew shorter, while hallucinations and fever dreams became more frequent. In his more delirious moments, witnesses claimed, the king would whisper names from his past. Jane Seymour, his beloved third wife, who died shortly after giving birth to his only legitimate son, Edward, was mentioned often. But there were also murmurs of Anne Boleyn, the queen he had sent to the scaffold. Some whispered that her ghost visited him, haunting his final nights. And yet, even as death crept closer, no one at court dared to utter the truth aloud. To declare that the king was dying was to risk being accused of treason. English law was clear, predicting the sovereign's death was punishable by death itself. So physicians continued their charade, assuring all that recovery was still possible, even as the unmistakable scent of rot seeped from the king's living body. By January 27, 1547, the end was clearly imminent, but the silence remained unbroken. At last, Henry acknowledged the truth privately. He summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to his bedside. Too weak to speak, the king responded to a final question by squeezing Cranmer's hand. his silent affirmation that he died in the Christian faith. It was his last conscious act. In the cold early hours of January 28, 1547, at the age of 55, the mighty Henry VIII, the prince once praised for his angelic beauty, the ruler who defied Rome and reshaped a nation. But even in death, the indignity of Henry VIII's condition did not cease. In fact, it only deepened. Because of his enormous girth, a standard royal coffin was entirely insufficient. A custom-built, oversized sarcophagus had to be urgently constructed, one large enough to contain the immense bulk of a monarch who had once dominated Europe with his authority, but now posed a macabre logistical challenge to his own undertakers. Preparing his body for burial proved to be a horrifying ordeal. The royal embalmers, though experienced, were quickly overwhelmed. Embalming techniques in the 16th century were rudimentary at best, far from the hygienic and scientific methods of today. The process consisted mainly of removing the internal organs and stuffing the hollowed body with strong-smelling herbs and resins in a desperate attempt to mask the stench of decay. But with a body as swollen and diseased as Henry's, the procedure was doomed to fail. As the days passed and the funeral arrangements were made, a grotesque chapter in the king's story unfolded, one that would be whispered about for generations. While Henry's coffin rested inside the chapel of Sion Abbey, awaiting the full honors of a state funeral, something deeply unsettling occurred. The coffin had not been properly sealed. Whether due to its sheer size or the rapid rate of decomposition, it began to leak. Late into the night, the silent sanctuary became the scene of one of the most disturbing moments in Tudor history. According to contemporary chroniclers, cadaveric fluids, dark, viscous, and foul-smelling, began seeping out from beneath the coffin. These bodily excretions trickled down to the chapel floor, creating a sickening pool. Stray dogs, likely attracted by the odor, wandered into the chapel and began licking the putrid fluid. It is a scene almost too grotesque to imagine, and yet it is recorded in the annals of history. This profoundly humiliating image, a king once hailed as God's anointed, now decomposing in his coffin and licked by street animals, perfectly symbolizes the final fall of a man who had shaped an entire nation. Henry VIII, the king who had defied the Pope, rewritten England's religion, executed his wives, and demanded absolute obedience, ended not with dignity, but as a bloated, leaking corpse. His body, in the end, was not revered by nature. It was desecrated by scavengers. And yet, the royal funeral proceeded. Nearly 3 full weeks after his death, on February 16, 1547, Henry was finally laid to rest. The unbearable stench from the coffin was impossible to ignore, but the ceremonies were carried out with all the grandeur that befit one of England's most powerful monarchs. Trumpets sounded, clergy chanted, nobles bowed, and then, in the depths of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the great king was buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him what he most desired, a legitimate male heir. Irony, however, would have the final word. Edward VI, the son whose birth had driven so many of Henry's most radical and ruthless decisions, including the monumental break from the Catholic Church, would sit on the throne for only 6 years. Sickly and frail, Edward died at the age of 15. His reign was brief, his legacy fleeting. The crown then passed to Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, she attempted to undo her father's religious reforms and restore England to Rome. Her reign was marked by bloodshed and persecution. But after Mary came Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the Queen Henry had executed. Elizabeth would go on to become one of the most revered monarchs in English history, ushering in a golden age that stood in direct contrast to the brutality of her father's later years. Thus, the grotesque and tragic end of Henry VIII stands as a sobering reminder of the boundaries of human power. This was a man who had once placed himself above the law, who saw himself as both king and high priest, who altered the very structure of his kingdom to suit his desires. And yet, in the end, he could not conquer his own body. The same man who once commanded empires was ultimately reduced to a broken, festering shell. As English historian Alison Weir eloquently wrote, "It is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise, beauty, and ability ended as a grotesque caricature of himself. He was tormented by both physical agony and mental unraveling, surrounded by flatterers and sycophants, feared by many, but truly loved by few." The transformation of Henry VIII from a radiant Renaissance prince into an obese, unstable tyrant remains one of history's most compelling cautionary tales. It is a brutal illustration of what happens when unchecked power, chronic illness, and emotional isolation converge in a single man. And yet, his political legacy, most notably the creation of the Church of England and the permanent separation from Rome, continues to shape the modern world. Even in death, Henry's shadow lingers, a symbol of majesty corrupted and ambition brought low by mortality. But in the end, Henry VIII's personal demise stands as a haunting reminder of just how fragile human life truly is. The final images of the once mighty king, gasping for breath, his body grotesquely deformed and riddled with infection, offer a stark contrast to the grand portraits that immortalized him in royal splendor. These painted illusions, full of majesty and defiance, now feel like lies when placed beside the harsh truth of his final moments. This dissonance between public myth and private suffering is, perhaps, one of the most powerful lessons left by his life and death. And so concluded the existence of one of history's most notorious monarchs, not with fanfare or triumph, but with an unbearable stench, a bloated corpse, and a funeral delayed by decay. The man who changed the religious and political course of England forever, who stood as a colossus of his time, came to an end as all mortals do, overwhelmed by the slow, unstoppable decay of the human body. His death was more than a historical event. It was a moment thick with symbolism, marking the collapse of the illusion of eternal power. As his body broke down, so too did the myth of divine monarchy, the idea that kings were chosen by heaven, untouched by the laws of nature. In the slow rot of Henry's final days, the English court was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. No crown can outshine mortality. And there is cruel irony here. The man who fractured his kingdom, broke with the Vatican, and executed those closest to him, all to secure a male heir, left behind a sickly son who ruled briefly and died young. His true and enduring legacy came instead through his daughters, especially Elizabeth I, born of Anne Boleyn, the very queen he condemned to death. She would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, shaping an era that bore her name. Perhaps the most profound truth in Henry's death is this: not even absolute power can rewrite the laws of life and death. He altered the laws of his land to serve his will, but in the end nature held the final word. The king who ruled over millions with unchecked authority was finally reduced to what we all are: flesh, bone, and impermanence. Henry VIII's death is not just a grotesque footnote in Tudor history. It is a grim parable, a story that echoes across time, reminding us that human greatness is always temporary. The same body once revered as the image of English royalty became a spectacle of decay, a symbol of how fleeting and fragile glory truly is. In this way, the death of Henry VIII continues to both horrify and fascinate, not simply because of the grotesque physical decline, but because it rips away the illusion that kings are gods. It reveals the vulnerable, decaying man behind the throne, reminding us all that power, in the end, cannot protect us from the fate we all share. If you found this story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are many more hidden truths and untold stories from history that deserve to be seen in the light, raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. Help us uncover them. Thank you for watching. And remember, even the greatest empires must bow to time.